interpret God's holy word for today. Lord, we thank you for this beautiful morning that we can gather and be your people in this place. Now we pray that you open up our hearts and our minds as we have heard your word, as we have come together in community. Let us understand the message that you still intend to speak to us at this day, at this time. May the words of my mouth, the meditations of all the hearts present here, be acceptable in thy sight. Amen. This week I came across an obituary that appeared in the New York Times a few years ago for Judith D. Peabody, who was a very prominent person in the city that never sleeps. She was born in Richmond, Virginia on May 6, 1930, and her parents divorced when she was a young girl, and later her mother married a New York lawyer. As a young girl, Judith attended Miss Hewitt's classes, a girls' academy in New York City, and graduated from Ethel Walker School in Simsbury, Connecticut. After attending Bryn Mawr for 2 years, Judith married Samuel Peabody in 1951. He was from a very illustrious New England family. His great uncle was the founder of the investment firm Kidder Peabody. His grandfather founded the Groton School in Massachusetts. His father, Malcolm, was a bishop in the Episcopal Church. His brother, Endicott, was the governor of Massachusetts in the 1960s, and his sister was appointed to the United Nations Human Rights Commission by President Kennedy. Mrs. Peabody became a well-known name in a post-war roster of socialites that included people like Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. Judith was a slender, stately woman whom designers such as Bill Blass and Donald Brooks loved to dress. She came to prominence in an age when newspapers reported her comings and goings by referring to her only as Mrs. Samuel P. Peabody. As I read her obituary this week, I thought to myself that she was the kind of person that would have been just the kind of guest to have been invited to this dinner party that we hear about in our gospel lesson today. The dinner was hosted by a leader of the Pharisees, and although we think of that word Pharisee, we think of the word meaning a hypocrite, but in those days, Pharisees were very influential and well-respected Jews. They were often called a teacher or a rabbi. They adhered to the strict observance of Sabbath rest and purity rituals and tithing and food restrictions based upon the Hebrew Scriptures and on later traditions. Now, not just anybody could receive an invitation to the Pharisees' dinner party on the Sabbath. You had to be somebody to get on that guest list. Now, I'm sure that there were prominent businessmen there, other religious leaders, probably some wealthy patrons of the temple, people just like Judith Peabody. And apparently the guest of honor was a man who had recently made a lot of news, an itinerant rabbi by the name of Jesus. I don't know if you've noticed it, but if you read the Gospel of Luke, you will find Jesus often depicted at a dinner table. For instance, there's the banquet at the house of Levi, a tax collector, who apparently was so excited that he invited all of his tax collector buddies to join he and Jesus. We find Jesus is invited to the house of another Pharisee, and their supper is interrupted by that woman that we know so well. She was a known sinner, and she knelt down at Jesus' feet, so overcome with emotion that the tears from her eyes bathed the feet of Jesus, and she dried them with her hair. Near Bethsaida, the city of Bethsaida, Jesus shared a meal from very meager resources with over 500 people that were hungry for a word from God. In Bethany, Jesus accepted the invitation to dinner with a pair of sisters named Mary and Martha. And then there was a house of Zacchaeus, a diminutive tax collector. You remember Zacchaeus? He was so small, they couldn't see Jesus, so he climbed up a sycamore tree so he could see Jesus come into town. He was so moved by Jesus that Zacchaeus pledged half of his goods to the poor. The table often provides, especially in the Gospel of Luke, for Jesus is as a setting for some very major teachings. In fact, in the Gospel of Luke, there is nothing more serious than a dining table. And so it is that this dinner party at the house of the leader of the Pharisees becomes an opportunity for Jesus to teach. And the first lesson that Jesus teaches is humility. As Jesus observes all of the guests coming in and jockeying for positions of honor, at that time, if you got close to the head table, that was kind of a neat thing. You could be seen as somebody close to the host of that great dinner party. It was good publicity for you. So people were jockeying for those positions. And Jesus looked at it and he taught his disciples about being humble. He said, avoid the possible embarrassment of maybe you go to one of those higher seats and then you're asked to move to a lower seat. It's better that you take that lower seat right away. He says humility and humbleness is part of living in God's kingdom. So always, always take the humble seat. That seems like a very easy thing to do, but sometimes we get caught up in social status and where we're going to sit and how we're going to be seen. I remember the first church I served out of seminary, I really didn't have to worry about where I would sit at public gatherings. As the pastor of a small church in a small town, I was asked to give prayers and say grace and give talks at all kinds of different organizations in town. If there was an academic breakfast at school, they might call me, a program at a nursing home, a talk to the Fellowship of Christian Athletes. Wherever the event was, there was usually a head table, and I was usually asked to sit there and be there with other speakers. Now, at first I found this very awkward, being at the head table, the center of attention. But then, I started to realize there's some benefits to that. They ask you to go first in the buffet line. They ask me usually to go first and say a prayer, and that's kind of neat. I'll never forget one time I was invited to give a talk to students at the local high school on being a good role model, and there would be a dinner in the cafeteria followed by several guests that were speaking. And when I walked into the cafeteria, there was hardly anybody there, but I sat down in what I knew to be the head table, and I began to go over my notes for my talk. And soon the cafeteria was filling up with people, coaches and teachers and parents. And a few minutes before the dinner was to start, the principal of the school came over and tapped me on the shoulder, and he whispered into my ear. He said, "Pastor, I'm sorry, we already have enough for the head table. Could you go sit at one of those other tables?" And so I slinked my way over to one of the other tables, and I got in line for dinner a little bit later than I normally would to receive my big helping of humble pie that evening. Like those disciples at the Pharisee's house, I learned that it's best to take that lower seat. Jesus says that being humble, being about humility, is what it means to live in God's kingdom. That's the first lesson he teaches around the table. The second lesson that Jesus teaches around the table involves the host of the dinner. And surrounded by all of the important people of the town, by religious and civic and business leaders, Jesus says, don't invite to your banquet those who can repay you. Rather, Jesus turns hospitality on its head and he says, invite the strangers and the poor and the crippled and the blind and the lame. Now, when you think about it, most of the tables that Jesus sat around during his life and ministry involved such people. Tax collectors, known sinners, people who had no social or economic status, those who were not connected in any way to the influential in his society. Around Jesus' table, those on the margins of society were placed front and center to remind us that a community is only as strong as its weakest members. So Jesus calls you and me to see who's not at the table that we are sitting around, to make a place for those who are forgotten or discounted or somehow seen as unworthy. So God's kingdom is not about limiting the guest list. It is about expanding the guest list as much as possible. As I read our lesson this week, I wondered what a person like Judith Peabody would have thought about such an inclusive table. How would she have reacted to Jesus on that day in the Pharisee's house? As I continued to read her obituary and I looked a little bit further into her life, I think I found the answer. I discovered that on one of their first dates, her potential husband picked her up where she was working at a youth center for delinquents. The detention center had bars on the windows, and Samuel had to announce himself, after which locks had to be unlocked before entering. And then he was immediately taken to Judith, who was in this large room, a former gym that also had to be unlocked. And then on entering, he found Judith surrounded by both boys and girls, her arm around one of them, and she was singing to them in her very bluesy voice. And they appeared to be so happy together. She introduced Sam to all of her charges. He joined them and her for the next 30 minutes. And on taking her home that evening, Judith pleaded with Sam, "Please don't tell my mother. She thinks I'm at French lessons." Later, Judith earned a certificate in psychology, and she established Reality House, an organization in Harlem dedicated to assisting heroin addicts who are trying to overcome their addiction. 3 mornings each week, she led groups of heroin users who were trying to deal with the personal issues that led to their addiction. After a friend died of AIDS, Judith became involved in the Gay Men's Health Crisis Center, where she helped raise funds for that organization and conducted support groups. As part of her volunteering at the center, Judy served as the care partner for 10 people with AIDS and would drop everything at a moment's notice just to attend to them. As I concluded finishing Judith Peabody's obituary, it was obvious that she would have been quite comfortable at a dinner table with Jesus. She understood that calling that all of us have as followers of Christ, to do all we can to extend the guest list, to put another leaf in the table, put another place setting there, and allow for all who want to come. You know, the society that we live in today is big on telling us our place based on our education, our family background, our age, our race, our gender, our sexual orientation. But Jesus' lessons around that dinner table remind us how important it is for us to know our place around God's table. What is your place and my place around the table with Jesus? Because it's there that you and I find not only the love for us, but the ability to look beyond our differences and love others with God's infinite love. Such table fellowship, as you know, is desperately needed in our world today. And you and I have a part to play in setting such a table in our worship, in our life together, in all of our ministries, and especially in the communities in which we live. Amen.